Tom, you mentioned where almost everything you've done so far has just been, relying on open source, maybe not formally, but keeping things, trade secret, never making or publishing them. And what's brought about, at least giving some thought towards protecting some of the things that you're developing? Is it because you're making a shift towards developing a product? Is it because you guys are starting to the phase of business development that you're in requires this next step? What is it that has you starting to think about these things?
I would say part of the reason that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about patents, and we've actually been thinking about it quite a bit more. If you think about a smart contract, you could almost classify it as like a licensing agreement, right? And you have to pay money to a wallet to use it, right? So if you think about just that in general, what does that mean for software? And how does that concept scale? So it's interesting that maybe a lot of people from blockchain community don't want to do that, but in order to use the virtual machine, I have to basically agree or follow a set of conditions, feed the machine money, and then I can effectively use that machine, right? So it's not technically a US government-backed patent, but I am basically paying to use a piece of software that I, in most cases, find it very difficult to reverse engineer, right? And so I just want to put that out there for the broader community, right? Part of the reason that we've really...
Well, it's a big challenge of open source, right? Is there's no...
yeah.
There's no help desk, that you call it.
There's no, yeah.
Support you with these things, right? It's kind of just sift through it and kind of navigate on your own, right?
Yeah, I think there's going to be some really interesting innovations happening that will sidestep government in that vein. But I would say that part of the reason that we've been looking at it is we walk into a lot of very large companies and we do a lot of prototyping projects for them. And they want to invest significantly in this technology because at the end of the day, it's governance, business, process automation, right, at its best. And for big companies, like if you walk into a big company, they're basically a gigantic firm of lawyers who are really good at filling out paperwork, right? And it's mostly process, it's mostly governance. And if you can automate that, that's going to fundamentally change the efficiencies of just about every major company on the planet. And big companies are beginning to understand that. And I think that's really interesting. And typically they've been hesitant for the GPL reasons that you're typically battling some sort of general counsel inside of a big company that says, well, hey, we've spent $40 billion investing in our infrastructure. Why would we give it away for free, right? And a lot of that is just sort of old school thinking because they're not necessarily familiar with the new economic model that's going to come out of blockchain in terms of value creation. They have to put on a completely different lens in terms of understanding how value is going to be created in the future. And so as we've kind of gone in the door, we've had to help some of our clients kind of navigate that because their typical response is, let me just patent that, let me own that. But a lot of the benefits that you get from blockchain is competitors sitting on shared infrastructure, right? So you can gain the efficiencies of a monopoly without necessarily being a monopoly, right? And that's kind of cool in a sort of distributed and decentralized way. And so they see all this stuff, and so they're trying to figure out how to navigate it. And at the same time, they're beginning to build things where they're going to have to play with competitors because that's just simply going to make infrastructure more efficient and their business is more efficient. And then people are doing patents at the same time, right? So you have the IBMs of the world who are doing a lot of blockchain patents, and people are getting scared because they're very used to IBM walking in the door and saying, you owe us money, or some other company, right? You have to pay this licensing agreement because I did this. And so in most cases, our conversations are rooted in how do we protect your future ability to operate? And I'm not a patent attorney at all. And so I called Keegan, and he's been extremely helpful in helping us understand that particular dynamic. Having released, decentralized apps and things like that, and then immediately within a week, there's some sort of CoinDesk article on a app that's like pretty darn similar, and it's a little disheartening. You're like, that's a application for some future thing you want to build, and we actually just built it in 3 months. And so we've had to help our clients kind of navigate that and think about that. We're also kind of, we've built a lot of internal custom tools to work with our clients, and so we've also been exploring and like, I've never open sourced anything, but I've also not necessarily like needed to. We've used a lot of open source, Node.js, Kubernetes, all that stuff. But we're exploring open sourcing something that we've built, and what does that process look like? And how can we get others to contribute to it? Is a patent the right process? Is a dual approach better? So right now it's like very early conversations for us, but we definitely like want to put out into the world some of the things that we've built.
Thanks.
Sure, yeah. Was the efficiency. So my partner and I just had a conversation yesterday. We're going to be developing our own internal products. So this was like, what's our first product going to be? And we kind of narrowed that down. But his question to me was, is it going to be open source or are we going to close source? And my answer was a little bit of both. And the reason for that being is that you get a wealth of knowledge from having your code open source, right? There is no help desk, but given that there are so many developers now in existence and there's so many developers that are developing in the blockchain space because they want to, and market cap also helps, you get a really interesting mix of actors. So for this coin that we just made, at fork, normally what you do is you fork a coin and you have the entire old history of the blockchain, and that's part of your new blockchain. We didn't want that old bloat. We wanted everyone to run a node and have kind of a fresh copy, right? So we just brought in the UTXOs, the unspent transaction outputs from both chains, and merged them together. The problem is on the Z Classic chain, it's a privacy coin, you have ZK snarks, meaning that there isn't anything really inside of those transactions. It's very difficult to parse through. So we just had a Russian guy who saw the project and started to write some Python utility for it. And then we started to communicate with him, and this is all open source, and he wasn't getting paid, we weren't paying him. But once we finished that, we then committed that, and it credited him, as this is an open source Python utility to scrape through ZK snark UTXOs. So it gets to me to get help, but there's definitely a lot of utility in that open source for sure.
I agree.
Sure. I think it would be hard to imagine a world without open source, right? Like we wouldn't have, the internet wouldn't exist in the form that it does today. We wouldn't have the Googles and the Facebooks and the huge tech giants that we have today. We wouldn't have most of the innovations that we have today if it wasn't for that.